happen on work and telling me at least 2 or 3 things that I forget each time. And we have Sarah Galvani who will be helping with the questions, helping coordinate them, because I'm sure it will stimulate a lot of questions for Andrew. So I suppose just to mention a couple of events that are coming up. We have a couple of anabolic steroid related events, imaging performance enhancing drugs, my shameless self-promotion, and my tell you about my inaugural professorial lecture, which is on the 9th of November in the evening at 5:30. That's done through Eventbrite and it's free. We wouldn't be able to charge people. And please, you're more than welcome to tune into that one. Also, we've got an international conference coming up on public health implications of anabolic androgenic steroids, and that's on the following day, on the 10th of November. Again, that's free, but requires registration in advance, and Sarah's going to be, she's just circulating the links there. So
they're in the chat now, Jim.
Brilliant, thanks for that. And we have the next in our series of webinars is focusing on stigma and the stigma of substance use with James Morris and Livia Allen's Rescue. And this follows on quite nicely from yours, Andrew, and some of those issues which you'll be discussing, so it fits in very well. Before I hand over to Andrew, I'll just say a couple of things. I think you've got his biography probably in front of you, so I'm not going to read that out to you. A couple of things, I'm sure many of you know Andrew, are familiar with his work. He has been around for an awful long time, I hope you don't mind me saying. But to put it into perspective, this is your 5th decade of drugs work, isn't it? It comes from the 80s forward. I'm not saying you've been here for 50 years, but it shows the breadth of that work. And in some ways, this is coming back to some of your early work as you work as a youth worker. I suppose the evidence base that you've been helping to develop, and probably equally, if not more so important, helping to apply, would have served you so well in those early days of being a youth worker. But I'll leave it to you, and I'll pass over to you now, Andrew.
Okay, well, thanks ever so much, Jim and Sarah, for inviting me and organising the event today, and hello to everybody. The presentation, you can see the title in front of you, Why Don't They Just Stop Using Drugs? Making the case for trauma and ACE-informed substance use services. And I would say broader than that, for those other people that may not be work in a drug service, but be it a youth worker or many other professions and volunteers that also will be coming into contact with people who've experienced trauma. So the plan is in the next 40 minutes to briefly cover the things that you see here. So initially around the nature and extent of ACEs, and I'll be referring to the national study that has been run on 3 occasions in Wales. Then to look very briefly at the kind of the science behind why is it that the experience of prolonged or extreme stress in childhood may make us vulnerable, potentially right through our life. Then to look at the association between what we know about trauma and drugs. Then some kind of very brief comments around how recovering from trauma, and then the kind of the role of drug services and others to work in a trauma-informed way. And if time permits, I'll say a few words around what I think could be an important application of routine inquiry, basically asking people about whether they had experienced trauma when they were young. So firstly, to look at the nature and extent of adverse childhood experiences. And the term now has been used for a couple of decades, possibly a little bit longer than that in the United States, to describe a wide range of experiences that children might experience before the age of 18. And those experiences are associated with prolonged or extreme stress. In terms of the international literature on this, there's an increasing body of information from around the world that looks at the long-term harms of extreme or prolonged stress in childhood. And in some of the kind of first proponents of this was this man here, Vincent Folletti, a physician in the United States in the 80s, who intuitively saw a strong association between trying to support adults with long-term weight difficulties and complex behaviours around that. And when he explored with his patients that had really big difficulties around kind of healthy weight issues, in many cases they spoke of abuse and neglect in childhood. And along with this man here, Robert Ander from the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, they undertook the first epidemiological study that comprised 17,000 patients in what we would call a primary healthcare facility in the United States. And again, the results from that showed this very strong association between those patients as adults that had the poorest health were more likely than not to have also experienced adverse childhood experiences when they were younger. So to describe what ACEs are, and then to give you a bit more information about the epidemiology around this, I'm going to use what is in effect the UK's largest population study looking at the relationship between ACEs and a range of health and behavioural factors throughout the life course. In Wales, the ACEs that were included in the study are the ones that I'm showing on the screen here. So there were initially around abuse, then around neglect in terms of being that kind of physical neglect in terms of somewhere to live, warm clothes, food and so on, but also emotional neglect in terms of things around kind of attachment and so on and so case. And then finally, a range of factors that children may experience in households that involves living with a parent or an adult carer in the home with a serious mental illness, a serious drug problem or a serious alcohol problem, but also how children can be negatively affected by violence within the home, by separation of caregivers, of parents, and also of how children may experience distress and harm as a result of an adult carer being sent to prison. The last time this survey was run was in 2018, and almost 2,500 adults from across Wales aged between 18 and 69 took part in the ACE study, and they provided anonymous information about their exposure to ACEs before the age of 18, and then a whole range of questions about their health and well-being as adults. I guess one of the most fundamental questions that they were asked was as follows, as it went along the lines of, when growing up, before the age of 18, did you once, twice, or more frequently experience any of the ACEs that you see on front of you? And if people said yes to any of those, that would be kind of counted as one ACE. Just to give you an indication of some of the percentage scores of people saying yes to these in the ACEs here. So we had 7% of people said they'd experienced sexual abuse in childhood. 17% you'll see had experienced parental violence, and things, I guess, pertinent to what we're talking about today. 6% said they'd experienced drug use, and in this context, that was people using heroin or crack cocaine, or people using alcohol in a harmful way. Each of the ACEs that you see here can be strongly influenced by other factors. So generally across the board, we see that the poorer people are within their communities, the more likely they are to experience some of the ACEs you see here. That doesn't apply to sexual abuse that seem to be constant across the kind of from affluence to deprivation continuum. And drug abuse, as defined in terms of heroin and crack cocaine, was strongly influenced by the age of the respondent. So you could imagine somebody who would take part in the study who was 60, 65, were much less likely to report that being a feature within their home environment compared to perhaps somebody who was in their early 20s or indeed their early 30s. In terms of kind of one of the big things that I think has kind of influenced a lot of work I've done around this was the realization that when we think about adversity in childhood and think, well, you know, where is it in our communities? You know, is it out there amongst certain groups of people, or, as I would strongly advocate, it's everywhere. It's amongst us, and those of us taking part in the seminar today, I dare say, you know, I'd see no reason why, if we had the opportunity to do a survey, that we wouldn't be too far off the results that you see on the screen here. So what the key finding, I guess, here is that on a population level, the more ACEs an individual has, the greater likelihood of them having poorer health and social outcomes in adult life. But, and it's important to realise that that is, of course, on a population level, and the other but here is the assumption that there's an absence of kind of resilience factors that can go a long way in mitigating ACEs and certainly preventing ACEs in the next generation. But just to spend a few minutes looking at some of the relationships here in terms of health harming behaviours, we see that people with 4 ACEs compared to those people with no ACEs, for example, are 6 times more likely to become a regular cigarette smoker. If you go down here, there's other ones around drugs, but if we look at the ones around violence, we see people are 14 or 15 times more likely to either be a victim or perpetrator of violence, and 16 times more likely to have used crack cocaine or heroin. If we look at various measures of low mental health and well-being, those people in the study with 4 ACEs compared to those with none reported that they were 3 times more likely to have never or rarely felt relaxed, 5 times more likely to have never or rarely feel that their problems have been dealt with well, and 6 times more likely to have never or rarely felt useful. And I think the concerning thing with some of those statistics is that if we were to turn those statements into positives, that would be one, for me, would give us one description of what resilience is about. And it begins to explain that if this is how we feel about our lives and our interaction with people, that does make life far more challenging and difficult compared to having resilience resources to fall back on when times are difficult. And in terms of kind of another final key finding here is the relationship between ACEs in childhood and the early onset of chronic disease. And again, here we see a strong association that those with 4 ACEs compared to those with none are more likely to have developed the serious chronic illness that you see on your screen. Just a few words about ACEs. There are ACE studies within the United Kingdom that have used other ACEs. So, for example, what's missing from the one in Wales is the death of a parent or carer in this way. But also there's a wide range of other factors that also can cause prolonged and extreme stress in childhood. So these might be things around critical illness or serious injury, bereavement, living in care, having caring responsibilities when we're young, being bullied, suffering discrimination and prejudice, and some of the geopolitical factors around kind of war, famine, and migration. So those of us, and I'll probably include myself here, that as less involved in the research, but more in the practical application of this, you know, I think we need to be a bit more sophisticated and recognise that there may be other factors that can still produce the same effects as the ACEs that were included in the Wales study. As you'd expect, the study in Wales set out to be representative of the population aged between 18 and 69. However, if we were to do a very targeted look at how that might change across certain population groups here, this is just one study from the Cork Simon Community Programme in Cork that supports homeless young adults, many with drug and alcohol difficulties and so on. And we see here that when they did a survey, every single person at that moment in time had experienced one type of adversity, and more than 3 out of 4 had experienced 4 or more ACEs, which is very much higher than the national figure from the wide-ranging study in Wales. So in terms of how is it that trauma can have this negative effect on people, what's the kind of some of the mechanisms around here? And just very briefly, if we look at what, if I may call, kind of a normal stress response here, that when we are faced with threat and danger, a part of our brain called the amygdala kind of sends warning signs to other parts of our brain. And what the amygdala does, it determines what is the best kind of chance of survival due to the threat that we face. And this is often referred to as a fight or flight response. And it's an innate biological response to a perceived or actual threat. And it's basically the body determining what we should do, whether we should take flight or fight, or indeed other things that we know from other responses here around freezing, flop, and befriending. And that might be, for example, befriending an attacker. And I think the important thing with all those potential stress responses, it's the amygdala determining what we do. It's not a situation where we're making necessarily a logical, risk-assessed approach. It's this primitive, innate part of our brain that determines what is the best chance of survival, or at least minimizing harm. Now, if we look at this from a trauma point of view, when somebody is in danger and feels trapped, these responses are activated in this way. But if people experience prolonged or extreme stress, instead of going into the recovery phase, people potentially can get stuck in this fight or flight response in this way. And at this point, you know, whether this is through ACEs or other potential causes of trauma, this can then begin to have a very detrimental effect, both in the short term and in the long term here, because the stress response is constantly activated. People may appear hypervigilant in the sense that they're already and always prepared for danger in this way. And when we think back to the slide a few back around the kind of relationship between the early onset of chronic illness, one of the factors that may be at play here is around this thing called the allostatic load, that basically kind of creates this wear and tear on our bodies and lays down, if you like, biological markers that potentially may make us vulnerable to such early onset of chronic illness as a result of what we may experience many years ago in childhood. How this then manifests itself, back to my youth work days, I guess, you know, of young people with a heightened emotional state, maybe anxious, acting in an impulsive way, and in turn that may create a whole range of difficulties of building relationships, and will certainly more often than not result in poor experiences at school in this way. And you know, I think one of the sad things that often still we respond to these behaviours in a further punitive way, be it isolation in school or indeed exclusion. and that is more often than not will create further trauma and escalate behaviour in this way. And perhaps those thinking about this from working with adults with drug problems and so on, again, a manifestation of what may have happened to us in childhood, or indeed, later in life, that people may have these characteristics here of poor decision-making skills, heightened startle responses, so on and so forth, and may begin to kind of explain that some of the adults that no doubt many of you will be aware of that could really perhaps benefit from the help and support of organisations, are sometimes some of the most reluctant to engage. And a reason for that may well be the kind of personality traits that you see described on the slide there. So there's good news though, before you bury your head on the table. With this is that ACEs should never define anyone, and there'll be many people observing this presentation today that will be living embodiment of that. And also the good news is what increasingly we understand around this phenomenon of brain plasticity is that whilst either in childhood or indeed in adulthood, the trauma, prolonged or extreme stress can have this negative effect on brain plasticity. We also know things around kind of kindness, engagement, supporting people can have a positive effect on brain plasticity. So we should never give up on anyone, and it's never too late to act to improve people's health. And whether you're a drug worker, an alcohol worker, or indeed work with people in other settings, we have an opportunity to make a difference due to the work that we do. So a few words really on connections around drugs and kind of, I guess, my statement of, why don't people just start taking drugs? There's increasingly work around this and the recognition of trauma being a factor that explains why some people have seemingly intractable drug problems throughout their life. And where it says here, doctors say it's not the drugs, it's the ACEs. I'm referring to an American doctor called Daniel Sumrock, and he talks about we shouldn't talk about addiction, we should talk about ritualized compulsive comfort seeking, which I think is a very interesting thing to explore. In terms of particular studies, and I'll provide references to what is a very quick look through this here. So Rothman and colleagues in 2008 published work around ACEs and how ACEs can be used to predict the early onset of drinking behaviour in young people, but also importantly how drinking prevention programmes also need to build in how we kind of engage with young people who may well be drinking because of the prolonged and extreme stress they're experiencing in this way. We see studies looking at strong associations between ACEs and higher risk of people being involved and experiencing mental health problems and drug-related problems. I think the study published in 2017 by Choi and other people did this amongst a cohort of people in their 50th years and above, and again found this strong association between what had happened in childhood and how that was still being played out in adulthood amongst a population of people aged 50 plus. We see studies linking ACEs to continued use of tobacco use. It's almost like a stepwise gradient here, that those people who experience the most ACEs were more likely to be the ones that had smoked the most and over a longer period of time. There are studies around prescription use of drug use and ACEs, and increasingly a number of studies, and including some work by Public Health Wales, again looking at how ACEs are linked to a range of lifetime illicit drug use behaviours, drug dependency, and also particular studies around injecting use. I guess one of the key people who's been quite outspoken about this is the kind of physician and philosopher Gabor Mati, Hungarian by birth, I think a US citizen now. And he has, he talks about that, if we look for those people with the most complex, the deepest types of drug behavior, inevitably, he says, the roots of that behavior will be in childhood trauma in this way. And someone closer to home, and a friend of mine, and someone I've known for over 30 years now, is Mark Gilman. Some of you will know for his work at Public Health England and the National Treatment Agency, was it, in this way. And Mark has now spoken quite publicly about the struggles he's had through most of his life. And he kind of takes a slightly softer view here from Mate here, and recognises there's a kind of world of difference to those people who take drugs for fun and those that take it because life is unbearable, neat. And Mark went on, and I heard him talk about this, of how opiates, but I'm sure Mark would agree that other drugs as well are a rational choice for people whose addiction is rooted in trauma. So in terms of recovering from trauma, I think historically we tend to look, and I think certainly in drug services, we tend to look to talking therapy as a treatment choice, but talking therapy is not the only way to heal in this way. And we now know that things are, be it kind of dance, art, yoga, music, and something I've got particularly interested in is around sport as well, can all have therapeutic benefits for people. And I think in the absence of clinical care for everyone, but also in not just the absence, but sometimes it's inappropriate for people to immediately kind of dive into talking therapies. There are other effective and necessary ways to recover. We know that personal relationship, community resilience can mitigate adversity. So the things we know about positive and reliable relationships, and the more that we can become more involved and connected with friends and people in our community like ourselves, can again go a long way in helping people to recover. But whether you are a therapist in the conventional sense, or whether you're involved in sports or running other kind of programs with people, it's people that help people recover, isn't it, in this way? And without that strong kind of relationship and connection, our work is so much more difficult. So I've, well, it finished in March this year, but I worked for 2 years in what was a police program in North Wales, of how the police respond to trauma and how the police begin to recognise root cause issues. It took on a wider role, and we worked with many agencies as well. But I think one of the things that became a key part of that program was the kind of recognition that when we look at trauma, that all of us have a part to play here. It's not just those of us with particular skill set, but some very kind of human aspects of being listened to, being treated with empathy, being treated with respect, means that every interaction we make with someone who is affected by trauma is an opportunity to support the recovery. And I think that is absolutely true and necessary as we're facing the pandemic that is COVID as well. So in the remaining 10 minutes or so, I just want to go briefly through some kind of key components of what a trauma and ACE-informed approach is. Firstly, it's one that, firstly, kind of a trauma-informed approach refers to how an organisation thinks about and responds to people who've experienced trauma. It's a whole organisation approach. The good deeds of most people could be unravelled by perhaps people within an organisation not working in a trauma-informed way. And perhaps the starting point is just the assumption whereby a trauma-informed approach assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma. And those of you who are purposefully working with, with vulnerable people, that certainly is not a wild assumption to make, because trauma is so common. Secondly, it's about understanding the consequences of trauma, and I briefly kind of showed some of these in relation to the kind of fight or flight response here. But the things that we see here, the consequences of trauma, these make the engagement with people like me and people like you so difficult in this way. So difficult if we find it very hard to read, facial cues and those social cues in this way, which may mean that we behave differently, we may appear aggressive in this way. And I think an important, aspect of this is these attributes, if you like, these traits of behavior are not things that, most of us choose. These are normal responses to what in many ways is abnormal experiences. Particularly in the field of drugs and alcohol, we recognise that some of the behaviours we see, whether that's the use of drugs or the tendency for people to perhaps behave in an aggressive or violent way, are ways of surviving. They're coping strategies for many people. And I think an understanding about these is so important for us all to perhaps respond to some of these things in a more empathetic manner. In a nutshell, what is a trauma-informed approach? I think at the root of this is this kind of fundamental thing that it's moving from an approach that perhaps all too often is asked what's wrong with people, which again can create further shame and blame and a sense of punishment. And if we kind of flip that around, instead of saying what's wrong with you, to one that asks kind of what's happened to you, that is a very different way to start a conversation with people, and I guess a very different way to run organisations that are about reaching out and engaging with people. It's important that our approaches don't re-traumatise people, and that also includes staff as well, who are at a high risk of kind of burnout, and potentially some of the people working in drug and alcohol services. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a greater proportion of the number of people who will have experienced trauma when they were young, and that might be a very factor as to why they've chosen a particular career path that they have. So in terms of asking about ACEs, I have done two pieces of work, one in Ireland and one in Wales, around this thing called kind of routine inquiry, of what I would say systematically asking people about ACEs. And I think just some thoughts for you to think about here, that I believe that this gives opportunities to open up important discussions, as long as we do them in a client-led and safe way, of course. It may help us to identify the root cause issue as to why they have been, seeking help. From if you like, a customer point of view, it gives a very different impression, and immediately perhaps helps people think that they're talking to somebody that understands the difference between what's wrong with me and what's happened to me in this way. It will certainly increase the visibility of trauma. And I think one of the things which we have at least 3 decades of research on, which is why people don't disclose what's happened, is that waiting doesn't always work. And people sadly probably go from almost a cradle to the grave, not having the opportunity to safely tell their story. So very briefly, in Ireland, in Clonmel, in a domestic violence organisation, a routine inquiry programme was in place that involved the women completing an ACEs questionnaire, and then a kind of client-led discussion. And the findings showed that it provided the basis for safe conversations and discussions about a range of intergenerational patterns and helped to create positive change. And there was strong feedback from the people that took part. about the usefulness of the questionnaire for providing a framework for conversations and documenting trauma histories. In Anglesey, I helped design and deliver a programme whereby health visitors routinely asked new mums and dads at the 6-week point when they would see a health visitor in Wales. The pilot set out to look at the acceptability from a patient point of view of being asked. It was very acceptable from the people that took part. They thought it was helpful. And from a practice point of view, a feasibility test. And again, that worked remarkably well. And initial concerns that the staff had about time and capacity, the need for onward referral, would it cause people to become upset? All those things were not realised in the pilot. So hopefully some things to consider, perhaps steps to take, is that we see things through the lens of trauma. This sense of changing from what's wrong to what's happened to you. I'd encourage you to think about and consider the relevance and feasibility of routinely asking about adversity and trauma. In terms of my some management experience, I believe strongly in routine. Whether that's kind of routinely asking people around injecting behaviour, how they might prepare drugs and so on, but also around other things as well, for it to become kind of standardised within the things that we can deploy within drug services in this way. And also for drug services to connect with a wider range of community assets, be it mutual self-help or be it sport, because these are the things that can help build and provide the kind of the steps for resilience and recovery. I think a useful resource that was published in the States 5 or 6 years ago now, I see here, by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is a good document, and it kind of systematically going through this. And they kind of put these kind of the four R's here. So about services realising the role of trauma, recognising it in the clients, and then responding in a safe and practical way with people. So thank you. Just thank the people you can see on my screen here who've influenced me, encouraged me. I've also thanked Substance Misuse Resources and Healthy Stadia, who has been employing me to do work around ACEs and trauma in this way. And if I may just plug a course I'm delivering in a fortnight or so. If you're interested in this, please contact me. It will involve a lot of the slides you've seen, but it's a 2-hour course, so there's a lot more to be had, including some videos and so on and so forth. So thank you very much.
Jamie, you there?
Jim disappeared.
Mary, you're going to have to take over here for a second.
Okay. I feel like, Andrew, that we need one of those walls like there is on Britain's Got Talent, where everyone can clap and shout and everything, instead of the kind of the quietness that kind of follows. But I've got a whole bunch of questions here that I've been writing down. So are you all right to start taking these questions?
Yeah, I'll do my best, yeah.
Okie doke. So the first one, obviously they've come in the chronological order, which I'll go through. The one question from Shelley was whether there was spiritual abuse reported in the Wales study, whether you came across that at all, and if so, where was it categorised? Where did it go?
Yeah, no, that wasn't one of the ACEs that was chosen. So unless that came up in I'm sure it may have done with the researchers, because it was a kind of household survey. The researchers went and met people face to face They were trained to also support people and to kind of signpost people for further help. But in terms of the study, that wasn't included, as indeed other forms of potential prolonged or extreme stress weren't. So, you know, I think I gave one example that, for example, the death of a parent or carer wasn't included, but there are other ACE studies that have included that. And I'm mindful I think Northern Ireland, they've included sectarianism as an ACE in their study. And if you look broader than that on a global basis, you will find examples of kind of prejudice being seen as an ACE. And I think the key thing, you know, if it's not including in our studies, you know, those of us from a practice point of view, we need to think wider than that.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. And then John asked about the 7% figure from that study for sexual abuse, and whether your view is that's sort of an accurate figure, given in particular that you know, the amount of male silence there is on male sexual abuse.
Yeah, well, I think that figure, and there's probably people will know a lot more about this than I do, but I think that figure is an underestimate compared to other attempts to quantify the extent of sexual abuse. You know, within be it England or Wales or, you know, within the United Kingdom. I'd recommend, and again, if you haven't got this, I can provide the link to what is that, around 4 different publications now from Public Health Wales. And I know that in the first publication, there was a good discussion and description of the methodology, and they acknowledged kind of weaknesses in that and why they thought certain things were perhaps people, you know, are higher or lower compared to other studies in this way.
Brilliant, okay. And then a question from Jackie, should we be separating ACEs and trauma, or should we be looking at all of trauma? And hopefully, Jackie, I've paraphrased you correctly there in terms of my implication is that she's saying, shouldn't we just be looking at trauma rather than saying, well, there's ACEs and it's traumatic?
Yeah, I agree. It's about trauma. And I think that distinction is important because not all ACEs result in trauma. For many reasons, that might be the case. And of course, as I've tried to, you know, allude, that there are other potential causes of trauma that for either good or bad reasons have not been captured in these epidemiological studies. So I think it's for me, it's this sense of prolonged or extreme stress and how that can result in trauma, and particularly, you know, result in trauma if there's an absence of support and other factors that we know can go some way in mitigating trauma. But yeah, I think I completely agree that, you know, it is about trauma. I think the interesting thing that I still not got an answer to is, I think one of the benefits of what some would call the, you know, the movement around ACEs in the United Kingdom, I think through starting at that point of adverse childhood experiences has actually resulted in a much kind of greater understanding about the extent of trauma within our communities. And I think has gone some way of, importantly, putting some of this knowledge in the hands of the public, which is so important. And the programme I was involved in Wales, that became one of our kind of ambitions in the second year of that programme. And we did lots of kind of community events, talks, screening of a film called Resilience, to do that very thing of trying to put this knowledge into the hands of the public and not, you know, tucked away amongst, you know, those of us that are able to, you know, have the opportunity to, from an academic point of view, or, you know, take part in events like this.
Okay, cheers. And then a question from Peter. Do you know whether the acknowledgement of trauma on its own helps without any further intervention? Is there any evidence around, you know,
gosh,
you know,
not, I don't regard myself as an expert on trauma. I think probably there's lots of people taking part in this who know a lot more about trauma, and particularly those kind of aspects. I think the opportunity to tell stories, have the opportunity to talk, it's a weight off my shoulders. From a personal point of view of talking to, friends and people I know, I think I've kind of experienced that. And I have a sense that, there's something important in that. But, for many people, that will be a start and not the end in itself in coming to terms and getting support and developing resilience as a result of what might have happened to an individual. But yeah, if that helps, I do think there's something in that is important. Being listened to. Yeah, seems to be really important with this.
Yeah, there was some because there was some one of Jim Orford's studies, I think, years ago, that showed that when they were randomizing people, it might have even been one of the big ones like UCAT or Project Match or something like that, but when they started to randomize people and did the assessment process, asking people about their substance use, and then they were randomized to one type of intervention or another, that the assessment process itself, was a really helpful thing to do, and sort of, the people had some benefit on it. So I'd have to go back and look at it for the detail, but it's a similar kind of thing, I suppose, that Peter's possibly getting at there, in terms of, as you say, just acknowledging it.
Yeah, and I think that's this sense of how we put this into the hands of the public, and how, those of us, whether it's the people we know through our family and friends, or the people we work with, or, giving people the opportunity, just listening to people in a respectful way can go quite a long way in helping people, recover from what has happened to them. Yeah.
Okay. Cracking on, the ACEs and resilience questionnaires in practice. Have you got any familiarities with those or any views on those? That's from Kenneth.
Well, I'm familiar with the ACEs questionnaire that was used because of the two the two routine inquiry programs I ran. We used the same one that had been used for the population study in Wales, partly so we could kind of link some of the data and make comparisons in that way. I think, it's it depends what we want to do with it. I think from an epidemiological study, I think the ACE one is probably the best we've got, but I'm sure that it can be refined and improved, and it only includes certain ACEs, as I've explained already in this way. I think using the ACEs questionnaire as part of a brief intervention needs to be done very, very carefully, because it was not designed to do that. It was not designed to do that. So I think, the two things are very different in that way. Okay. Again, I think there are other people probably taking part in this in terms of questionnaire design that will have a much greater depth and knowledge than I have.
And I'm saving the chat as I go, so you get a chance to see all the comments and things from people.
Okay, right. Oh, that'd be good.
There's lots of positive comments.
There's one from John Flaherty here as well, a question I'll read out if that's okay. It's just come through. One of the criticisms around the use of ACEs, the ACEs course, is that it still focuses on the individual and the family and ignores wider structural factors that feed into creating difficult lives for people, such as poverty and inequality. What do you think of this?
Yes, I agree. It does. We've got to do both. It was not designed to tackle deprivation. It wasn't designed to give us a kind of an outlook on that. What we do know in Wales is that those people, I think those people from the poorer parts of the sample, if you like, that continuum from affluence to deprivation, those people in the most deprived parts, in terms of the study, were, compared to those in the most affluent, were 3 times more likely to have experienced 4 or more ACEs. So of course, I still believe the biggest gain for public health, if pushed to choose one, is tackling deprivation.
Yeah,
if that helps or hinders, I don't know. Starts another argument, but it'd be nice if we could do both more than what we do.
I've got a few more here. Chris asked, is the assumption that ACEs or trauma is associated with stress without other factors sort of being involved?
Well, it's that. I think it's about the severity and the frequency of stress. You know, we all experience stress every day to a small degree, and we know that we can sometimes cope with quite severe stress if it's perhaps temporary, and especially if we've got people on our side that have got our backs, that are there to help us when we're having to deal with something that's profoundly difficult. For example, you know, the death of somebody is an example of that. So I've lost track. What was the question? Sorry.
It was, let me just go back. Is the assumption that ACEs, or is there an assumption that ACEs and trauma is associated with stress without other factors being, you know, part of the picture?
Well, I think this, in terms of defining stress, or if we define, you know, extreme stress, I could look at things around post-traumatic stress disorder and things like this, that it is stress, but it's this sense of what the Americans call toxic stress. That, you know, it's stress that's extreme, profound, and also there's no mitigating things that can help us with that. And that mechanism of how actually that affects our body, our brain and body in this way, and how that, you know, can affect our emotions, how we present, and be linked to actually the, you know, the early onset of chronic disease and so on, is a kind of key driver for that.
Okay, thank you. And then James asked about how he'd be really interested to know how the thresholds for ACEs and trauma are defined.
Yeah, and again, I think there's a big difference here between the epidemiological study and practice, because I think I said it during the presentation, for somebody to have experienced, you know, one ACE amongst the 10 that took part in the study was as straightforward as saying, you know, did you, when growing up before the age of 18, did you once, twice, or more frequently experience the ACEs that were presented on the screen? So it's not a measure of, you know, of regularity or severity in that way. You know, I think from the use of the questionnaire in different countries, from an epidemiological tool, that's kind of good enough to begin to make some of the associations between adversity, trauma, and then health and social behaviour in adulthood. But if we're thinking about using this from a practical point of view, again, we have to be a bit more sophisticated than that. You know, I think the risk is, and it's interesting, I think there's a thread with some of the questions that, you know, can we use the questionnaire somehow to, you know, do a little mini assessment of people and then begin, you know, for it to predict how best we can support those people? No, we can't. It was never designed for that. It's an epidemiological tool that, you know, I think for the routine inquiry has been kind of used, but that's in a very different context than just, you know, going off on that. I think that, you know, it could be misused in that way. We need to hear people's stories. We need to talk with people and find out, you know. And one of from the 2 studies that I was involved in, the routine inquiry ones, people were asked almost that same question, or, you know, the list of 10 or 11 ACEs in Ireland, did you experience any of these before the age of 18? But whether people had said yes to one or yes to all 10, the next question was along the lines of, you know, could you tell me please, you know, did the ACEs that you've said, how have those negatively or positively affected you as an adult? So that's a good example of an open question. It's not judgmental. It's not assuming that it will have had a negative effect, because there may have been a whole lot of support and resilience to mitigate that. And it gives that chance for people to explore that. You know, did it, and you know, that did it positive, you know, have these things affected you positively or negatively? I think the positive one was interesting. You know, perhaps a minority of people would say, well, you know what, you know, it's maybe the person I am today. I've bounced back. Those experiences that I experienced that were difficult for me as a child are the ones that have made me you as I am now in this way. So I think it's those kind of gentle, you know, respectful conversations with people. And at that point, whether we've given them a questionnaire of 10, 5 or 15, we should also be saying, and was there anything else in your childhood that also caused prolonged or extreme stress? And in some of our communities now, they'll be saying, yeah, you know, as a kid, I was brought up in Syria and I saw my uncle killed in front of me. And then we became refugees and this happened to us. And of course, you know, are those ACEs? Well, not if we go by the questionnaire, but may children been affected by those in a negative way? Of course they will.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of means to an end, I think, in a way, to have those kind of conversations.
Okay. And I think there was one comment from Jenny, and then I'll open it up. I know Andrew said that he's able to stay beyond 2. If Jim's not around to take over from me. Cruel to ask and not offer support if there's not resources. So this was a comment about, you know, should we be asking people routinely really about ACEs and trauma if we haven't got the links to other specialist organisations to forward them onto because they've been closed or not funded or whatever?
Yeah. No, that's no reason not to give people the opportunity to talk about these things. In terms of when we look at people recovering from trauma, I would assert that there's just a minority of us that do so, if you like, by receiving specialist talking therapy help in that way. And many people recover through the support within their communities, from family, from friends, through the involvement in different programs and so on and so forth. The health visitor program, understandably, the staff said the same question. How can we be asking about this when we haven't got the referral pathways? There's a 6-month wait for this type of intervention. They went ahead with it with reservations, and during the 6 months that people were given the opportunity to be asked, that meant almost 300 people had had a child, and at the 6-week visit, you know, had this kind of intervention, if you like. Not one person out of that was deemed where there was a kind of a necessity for that person to be referred on to more specialist help. That surprised us. We'd made provision within the intervention of what we would do if people were upset, what would we do if people clearly needed help sooner rather than later. And we were amazed that that those kind of contingencies seemingly were not necessary, but that the value of having those conversations with health visitors for some people seemed to be quite profound. And a number of the health visitors, you know, the report's interesting because one was on record to say they were dead against this for various reasons, and that person became one of the strongest advocates of it in this way. I think it's this idea of how we put this story into the public domain in this way, and how we have conversations and how we talk about this. And of course, we do need specialist services as well. But we'll be waiting forever if we do that. And you know, some of the other work, you know, use examples of how sport can, you know, particularly in younger people, has a really healing power in this way. There's a fabulous program in Bristol called the Empress Boxing Gym, where kids learn to box, but they also, it's a mental health service as well.
Yeah.
And that nobody sat down and had a counselling session, but through the everyday relationship and conversations and support and kindness and showing interest and encouragement, those things will help a lot of those young people recover from abusive, neglectful childhoods.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think the other thing, just to be fair to Jenny, is I think one of the points that she was making that I didn't pick up on sufficiently was that actually sometimes if there are other services to refer on to, that often they don't want people because they're using still. So
yeah,
she was making. So.
Yeah.
That's it for my list of questions. I don't know whether Jim's there or Sarah, you want to
I think what we can do is, I'm going to stop recording now. This can be more if people want to come on their mics and ask a question, we can do that. Just Andrew said he'll stick around for a few more minutes. While I still have a few people on, just a reminder that I will email out the recording link when it's available next week. Andrew has kindly said that we can use his slides as well, so he's going to edit them and I'll forward them on to people. And also I'll email the link for that training info, because I know it came up in the chat that a few people were looking for more information on the training. So I'll email all of that out next week once I have the recording link available. But if anybody wants to come on their mic and ask a question, they're more than welcome to. I'm going to stop recording now.